My name's Annie. I'm the events coordinator at Majors and Quinn Booksellers, which is an independent bookstore in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If this is your first virtual event tuning in with us, welcome. If it's not, welcome back. Thanks for tuning in to all these wonderful virtual author events we've been having over the past year. Today, we're very excited to have a conversation between two authors who are actually based here in the Twin Cities. So it's great to have them on board. Kawai Strong, Washburn, and Jonathan Slaght, who are going to be talking about some Earth Day related themes, environmental themes in both of their work. I will be dropping links to both of their books in the comments. If you're watching on Facebook, there's comments under the video. If you're watching on YouTube, the chat function is there for you. And speaking of that, that is also where you should say hello to us. So let us know where you're watching from, say hello, and also we will be taking some audience questions at the end of the hour. So at any point during the broadcast, you can write your questions in the chat or the comments, and we will see them here, and we'll pick a few to answer at the end of the show. We are going to hear some readings and actually some presentations from Kawai and Jonathan. It's going to be fun. And then they'll both come back and have a conversation with each other. So stay tuned for all of that good stuff. I'm going to do brief introductions of these guys, and then we'll get on with the show. Kawai Strong Washburn was born and raised in the Hamakua Coast, Big Island of Hawaii. His work has appeared in Best American Non-Required Reading, McSweeney's, and Electric Literature's Recommended Reading, among other outlets. He was a 2015 Tin House Summer Scholar and 2015 Breadloaf Work Study Scholar. Today, he lives with his wife and daughters in Minneapolis, and Sharks in the Time of Saviors is his first novel, and it is now available in paperback. And we also have with us tonight Jonathan C. Slaght, the Russia and Northeast Asia coordinator for the Wildlife Conservation Society, where he manages research projects on the endangered species and coordinates avian conservation activities along East Asia Australasian flyway from the Arctic to the tropics. His annotated translation of Across the Ussuri Krai by Vladimir Arseniev was published in 2016, and his work has been featured New York Times, Guardian, BBC World Service, NPR, Smithsonian, Audubon, and others. And his new book, Owls of the Eastern Ice, was longlisted for National Book Award and a finalist for the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. And he, too, lives in Minneapolis. Thank you both so much for being here. We're going to start with Jonathan's presentation, and Kawai will be back in a few moments.
Annie for, let's see, is muted. Okay, I'm getting conflicting messages about whether I'm muted or not, so if I'm muted, please let me know. Thank you for the invitation, especially to Kawai for inviting me to speak to him today on Earth Day. So I have a brief presentation about my book, and I'm going to attempt to share that here. And this will be about 10 minutes long, and then Kawai will speak a bit about his book. So yeah, so I wrote a book about owls, Owls of the Eastern Ice. It's coming out in paperback on June 1st, and there's a lovely quote on the cover of the paperback from our own Lori Herzl of the Minneapolis Star Tribune. And yeah, it's a book about this really remarkable owl species, the black-crested fishel. I mean, these things are just enormous. I mean, females can exceed 11 pounds. They have 6-foot wingspans and stand about 2.5 feet tall, which is about the size of a fire hydrant. But I think one of the reasons that the book has been popular across diverse readership, and I think one of the reasons that I'm talking to you tonight is because it's not just about owls. It's also very much about people who share the forest with these owls and share the natural resources with them. And I think also it's a story about hope. You know, it's a story about an endangered species and people working together to try to make the world a better place for it. So there's a lot of you know, unpleasant stories in the media about nature and wildlife, and hey, here's one that's not it doesn't end in tragedy. So before I talk about the owl itself, and I want to kind of pull back for just a second and talk about the region where the story takes place. So it takes place in the Russian province of Primoria. way out there in the Russian Far East, bordered by China, North Korea, and the Sea of Japan, or the East Sea. And the village that I go to for most of my work with the owls, which I still do to this day, it's about 45 degrees latitude, which is essentially the same as us here in Minneapolis. So it's a mountainous region. It's remote. It's poor. It's low human population density. There's about 2 million people in the province, but half of those are in the capital city of Vladivostok in the south there alone. And then kind of the further north you go, the more sparse it gets. It's a mountainous region, beautiful, rugged coastlines, sandy beaches, clear blue water, these amazing, fast-flowing rivers rushing through these river valleys to pour out into the sea. And there's people living in this place, and I think you can, this picture of Ternay, the village, is I think it's a good representation of how people fit into this landscape, right? This isn't a place where nature necessarily bends its will to humans. It's the other way around. Like, look how this village is kind of really tucked where it can fit between the mountains and the river here. It's a rustic life. A lot of the people who live in these villages are, they're hunters, they're fishermen, and they're farmers. I mean, their livelihoods very much depend on the forests around them and the ocean and the rivers. So sharing this same space with them is some pretty incredible wildlife. I mean, there's tigers here, there's leopards, there's bears, and this is the only place in the world where we actually have brown bears and tigers living in the same place at the same time. There's other weird stuff. This is a raccoon dog. It's a dog species. It's the only dog species that hibernates in winter. And there's Siberian musk deer. I mean, look at this thing. The males have these extended canines that poke out of its mouth like vampire fangs. And so kind of my point in telling you all this is to really illustrate that the fish owl isn't just one remarkable species in an otherwise mundane landscape. It's part of this rich, vibrant, exotic tapestry of wildlife and humans in the same place. So fish owls really need two things to be happy. They need two things from the landscape. They need really big trees, old growth, 200-300-year-old poplars and elms, just something big enough for them to fit a nest into. And the second thing they need is fish-rich rivers. Now, historically, over time, there wasn't much conflict between the needs of humans and the needs of fish owls in this space. So this map here shows just Ternay County, which is the northernmost county in Primoria and where most of the book takes place. As you can see, in the middle of the 1980s, there are fewer than 150 miles of road in this 20,000 square kilometer county. And as it turns out, as I know now, it's all really fantastic fish owl habitat. And then fast forward just 20 years, look at that. There's now nearly 3,000 miles of road in that same space. Now, what's really interesting is that in this 20-year period, the human population didn't change. And there were 15,000 people in the mid-'80s, and there were 15,000 people in 2005. Now, there's even more roads than there were then, but there's even fewer people. There's only 10,000 people there now. So the conservation problem comes from this sudden proliferation of roads. I'm going to read just a paragraph from the introduction to sort of set the scene for why I got involved with fish owls at all. Fish owls in Russia were vulnerable. For a naturally low density and slow reproducing species, any large-scale or sustained disruption to the required natural resources could mean a precipitous population freefall. Fish owls and other endangered species were protected by Russian law. It was illegal to kill them or destroy their habitat. But without concrete knowledge of what their needs were, it was impossible to develop a workable conservation plan. No such approach for fish owls existed. By the late 1990s, previously inaccessible forests in Primoria were increasingly becoming sites of resource extraction. Conservation is different from preservation. Had I wanted to preserve fish owls, I wouldn't have needed research. I could have lobbied the government for a ban of all logging and fishing in Primoria. These broad measures would protect fish owls by eliminating all threats to them. But aside from being unrealistic, such a move would ignore the 2 million people living in the province, a proportion of whom rely on the logging and fishing industries for their livelihoods. The needs of fish owls and humans are inextricably linked in Primoria. Both had depended on the same resources for centuries. Before the Russians came to dip their nets in the rivers and harvest trees for construction and profit, Manchurian and indigenous populations did the same. The Udege and Nanai made beautiful embroidered clothing from salmon skins and fashioned boats from enormous hollowed-out trees. Fishel reliance on these resources has remained at modest levels over time. It's the human needs that have escalated. My intention was to return some balance to this relationship, to conserve the necessary natural resources, and scientific research was the only way to get the answers I needed. So I hooked up with these two guys. They're both named Sergei, collectively the Sergeys, Sergei Avdyuk and Sergei Surmich, the only two people who had really been doing any kind of research with fish shells in Russia at the time. And so we came up with a plan to collaborate. And what we're going to do is find fish shells, catch them, put GPS units on their backs, like little backpacks, then use that data to understand what parts of the landscape are important for fish shells, and then devise a conservation plan. I really want to underscore that this was a true collaboration. I think that the Russian side would have been unable to do everything that we were able to accomplish if they had been going it alone. And there's no way I could have just plopped down in the middle of the Russian forest and figured out how to find or catch fish shells. So the success of this project was very much the result of a collaboration between people who had the same vision in protecting these marvelous birds. So the book itself is, a lot of things happen. I mean, there's, and I'm not going to go into the details of it. I mean, there's helicopters, there's snowmobiles, a lot of snowmobiles. There's random overnights in hunter cabins. There's bathing in radioactive radon hot springs. There's a lot of time outside in terrible weather, and there's owls. But I think with the remainder of my time this evening, I really want to focus on why this matters, what the implications were of this work, and why it matters to us here in Minnesota or wherever you're watching from, and to the owls themselves. So this is kind of a photograph showing a part of that road network. So I alluded to this before, but all these roads are essentially they're logging roads. And so here's what it looks like. You got the dirt track kind of crossing this broad valley or crossing this frozen river. And so because the region is so mountainous, almost all the roads are in fact in the river valleys. Now this map here shows some of the raw data from the backs of the fish owl. So all these points are a daily location of where a fish owl was at that time. And as you can see, or I hope you can see, all the fish owl points are also in the river valleys. And so you have this clear conflict, like where the roads are, that's exactly where the fish owls too. And this isn't hypothetical. I mean, there are, fish owls lose their nest trees to bridge construction. Fish owls are hit and killed by cars. So, but because logging is such an important part of the local economy, as I mentioned earlier, we can't just ban logging. And it's also important to understand that the trees from Primorius forest, it ends up in North America. It goes to Europe as flooring. And this isn't necessarily bad logging the way it's done. They do selective logging where they take out strips of a forest, allow regrowth, and then come back 20 years, 30 years later to harvest more. It's not clear cutting, which is just really devastating for the landscape. And with respect to fishing, people use these roads for recreational fishing, for subsistence fishing. And there's also a lot of commercial fishing. And so fish from Primorius waters is sold throughout Asia. So with our data, like once we're able to figure out which parts of the landscape were important, like where owls were concentrating their use, we were able to develop a basic conservation plan that we shared with the logging company. And the first part of that plan was a map identifying these hot spots for the best fish owl habitat. And these are now no harvest zones and places where they have to avoid when they're putting in a road. So this plan allows for the owls to be happy on their side of the valley and the road network to exist on its other side of the valley. Another conservation intervention that resulted from this study is identifying hotspots on the existing road network and blocking vehicle access to it. Sometimes a case like this, a giant berm, sometimes the logging company takes out specific bridges at key locations. So essentially we're identifying places where we know there are fish owls or it's good habitat for tigers, for bears, for boar, for whatever, and then just blocking vehicle access to those areas. Then the final intervention is helping fish owls breed, because it takes 200 to 300 years for a tree to grow big enough for a fish owl to fit in. Sometimes the forest just is too young. So we started putting these barrels, these 55-gallon drums in trees, and Fishel started occupying them and breeding in them. At this site, we put up this box in 2015. They've now bred 3 times in there and produced multiple chicks. So this is my last slide, and I'm just going to read, I guess, the last paragraph of the book, which really sums up my feeling about this place and the promise that is sustainable use of the natural resources in Primoria. Primoria is, more so than most of the temperate zone, a place where humans and wildlife still share the same resources. There are fishermen and salmon, loggers and fish owls, hunters and tigers. Many parts of the world are too urban or overpopulated for such natural systems to exist. In Primoria, nature moves in a flow of interconnected parts. Fish owls are a symbol of this functioning ecosystem, a demonstration that wilderness can still be found. Despite an ever-increasing network of logging roads pushing deeper into fish owl habitat and the resulting threats to the owls, we continue to actively collect information to learn more about these birds, share what we discover, and protect them and the landscape. With proper management, we'll always see fish owls in the rivers here, and we'll continue to follow tracks of tigers that weave among pine and shadow in search of prey. And standing in the forest under the right conditions, we'll hear the salmon hunters too, the fish owls, announcing like town criers that all is well. Primoria is still wild.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic, John, and it'll be hard to follow up. And so hopefully everybody out there can see me. It's really strange. This is a new platform to be using for these presentations. I'm all alone. I can't see anybody. Normally I can at least see the other panelists. So it's just me here by myself. And you know, I'll talk for a few minutes and give another little slideshow to talk about some of the aspects of my novel that I think overlap with some of the things that John was just talking about. And then, you know, we'll open it up for a little bit of a discussion and follow that up with a Q&A. And I hope people like my hat. I can't see any of you out there, but I hope you like my hat. I'm wearing it because my hair, people have been asking, my hair is starting to get kind of long and out of control. So I'm wearing a hat to help make me look a little more presentable. So I will talk for just a little bit about a few things that are a part of my novel that I think a lot of people have come to understand, but for some people it might not be quite as apparent. So, oh wait, it hid. Hold on a second. So when a lot of people think of Hawaii, which is the anglicized way to say Hawaii, which is the name of the islands when you use Olelo Hawaii, which is the language of native Hawaii, of the people that were there first. When a lot of people think of the islands, I think some of these images are the first things that come to their minds, right? That one on the left there is Waikiki Beach. And a lot of people think not only about beaches, but about sort of wonderful clear water with animals like dolphins in it, or people think about surfing, right? And those are some of the first images that come to people's minds when they think about the islands. And there's another set of images that I think have been trending even longer that in my mind are part of the problem with the way people perceive the islands, in addition to some of this, which is true, but is not the complete story, right? And so some of those images are things like this, right? In particular, hula. When we think about hula, we talk about hula girls and that whole image of the islands. That's an image that has been borne out over time as a result of a sort of Western presence coming to the islands and seeing the islands as a paradise that is available for packaged consumption, for people to come to the islands, take what they want from them, and then leave. It's sad that hula is a part of that, because hula is, in particular, is a very powerful and important part of Hawaiian culture. It is the living document, the living history, past, present, of the people of the islands. And so to have it be kind of debased in this way is particularly problematic, but it goes along with some of those earlier images. And I'll get into a little bit more of that in just a minute. I want to give you just a brief history of Hawaii for those of you that are unfamiliar. And some of this comes up in the novel as well. I'll come back to that in just a minute. But the islands were settled. It's hard to know exactly when they were settled, but the date falls somewhere in the range of about 600 to 1130 AD. And for the next 600 years or so, the islands were able to be isolated, right? They remained isolated, and this incredible culture built up among the islands. The people of the islands, they learned not only how to live within the ecosystems that were there, but also how to start to live with each other, right? And there was plenty of conflict, and there were plenty of things that were difficult about that. And there's also a lot of archaeological history that there were parts of the islands where ecosystems collapsed due to overuse. But the people that were there largely learned, right? They were very intelligent. They understood how to read the cues of the land they were living in, and they learned how to live in a very sustainable structure, right? And so about 600 years later, 1778, Captain Cook, who's a Western explorer, visits the islands. And at that time, the estimated population of the islands is around 200,000 people. Could be even more. It's hard to know exactly what the numbers are. There's a variety of sources that can be used to estimate it. And so just keep that number in mind as we get a little farther down here, because I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But 200,000 people living in a very sustainable pattern with the land, right? So about 30 years later, the islands are united under King Kamehameha I. So he's the first ruler that was able to take all the islands and put them under one sort of sovereign ruler. Now, that's certainly something that different people have different ideas about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But ultimately, by 1810, you have basically one united kingdom of Hawaii. About a decade later, the first Christian missionaries started to arrive. And within 30 years of the arrival of the Christian missionaries and other Western interests, including business owners, you have a native Hawaiian population that's fallen to about 60,000 people. So from 200,000 people, less than 100 years later, you have 60,000 people left. There are a variety of reasons why that happened, but very large. The two largest factors are generally considered to be disease and the introduction of alcohol, which obliterated native life in a lot of very unfortunate ways. About 40 years later, these same foreign business interests that had shown up in the early 19th century, they banded together and calling themselves the Committee of Safety, and they organized a militia-led overthrow of the sovereign nation of Hawaii, right? They overthrew the Hawaiian monarchy, and at the time that they instigated that armed rebellion, that illegal armed rebellion, they then lobbied for the support of the United States Marines, and a contingent of United States Marines landed on Oahu and backed up the militia as they overthrew the kingdom. About 5 years later, the kingdom was formally annexed by President William McKinley, and it became I think at that point it was considered a territory. I don't know exactly what the term was for that time. And it continued in sort of that ambiguous part of the United States, but not an actual state, for quite a while before it became the 50th state. So that's just a very brief history of Hawaii about the time before there were any sort of external influences, and then what happened over the course of the time that explorers had visited. So think about those first images we saw, right, about the ocean and sort of this pleasurable package for exotic consumption, right, that a lot of people think of when they think of the islands. This is what I think of when I think of the islands. I think of the original people that lived there, the Kanaka Maoli or Kanaka Oiwi. There are several different terms that are used, but the original native Hawaiians that existed for quite some time. It was a proud, intelligent, well-established civilization, a sovereign nation that had its own beliefs and its own structures and was doing its own work to develop at the time of the arrival of foreign interests, right? And so that's what I think of when I think of Hawaii. And I also think of images like this, right? We have islands now that are modern in the sense that they have things like skyscrapers and traffics and all the sort of things that we associate with modern life. But there are also elements of a much greater, richer heritage that I have not seen in quite the same way anywhere else that I've lived, right? You can see that we have Hula Kahiko, which is there in the upper right corner, or might be the left side, but you've got people in traditional outfits that are performing a traditional version of hula. The Hula Kahiko is the more ancient form of hula. It more closely represents the type of hula that was practiced before the arrival of Western influence, particularly Christian missionaries. And then there's also something a lot of people don't know about, where there are other parts of Hawaii that have been influenced by other waves of immigrants that came. And so you can see there's another picture there of a cowboy that's roping some people up. And this is a part of culture that's on the island that I'm from, the Big Island, which is called Paniolo culture, these are ranchers and cowboys that came and worked on the Big Island and several other islands when there was a established ranch, industry as well. So those are a lot of things I think of, along with the more ancient parts of Hawaii when I think of the islands now, right? And I think for a lot of people, they don't recognize the truly sophisticated and sort of cosmopolitan nature of the islands, both in terms of its embrace of the more modern aspects of the world, as well as having this rich heritage from an entire civilization that lived in its own independent sovereign way before the arrival of Western influence. This is just a quick slide to talk about a few things I think a lot of people don't think of when they think of the islands as well, right? And it might be hard for you to read some of these things. I don't know what your displays are like, but basically there are a lot of things about living in the islands that are very difficult, especially from an economic perspective. It can be one of the places that, given the timing and sort of what surveys you're looking at, it can be one of the most expensive places from a perspective of just basic food goods, right? Whether we're talking about things like bread or milk or cheese or, just sort of basic grocery staples. It has some of the highest prices for those in the world, right? Real estate is like that. So rent can be very expensive, and jobs don't necessarily have the sort of salary that allows you to live off that. If you are even lucky enough to have a salary, if you're living off an hourly wage, it could be even that much harder, right? And most people I know in the islands have working two jobs, driving all over the island to make ends meet, right? And so that's the state of Hawaii today. It's a mix of a bunch of different things that I think a lot of people don't think of when they are thinking about the islands, or even when they visit. They might not realize the true nature of what life is like for people there. And that's one of the things that I talk about in the novel. I'm just going to finish up with one last part that I think, and this is the place where I think that there's a lot of commonality between the things that John has talked about and some of the things I talk about in my novel as well. And goes back to that very first slide. It is true, as a matter of fact, that the islands are full of incredible natural beauty. The ocean ecosystem in particular is a place that I spent a lot of time, whether it was surfing off of point breaks or swimming in beaches and diving near reefs and snorkeling and scuba diving and all those different things. There are a lot of my most formative and wonderful experiences growing up, and my sort of initial relationship with the land came through these sort of incredible natural environments I was very fortunate to live in while I was in the islands. But if you take a look at a reef like that as it exists now, this thriving, beautiful, colorful ecosystem, this is what's happening now, right? So some of you are probably familiar with this. This is actually a bleaching event. This is what happens when the temperature of the water moves into a high enough temperature that it becomes unlivable for the coral, and it expels the algae that it has a symbiotic relationship with. And if that goes on long enough, the coral dies, right? And this is a result of the oceans absorbing a very large amount of CO2, and that CO2 both raising the temperature of the water and also changing the pH balance of the water. And that's why they refer to it as ocean acidification, right? So that process is what leads to bleaching, and it kills reefs. It's killing parts of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. It's killing parts of the reefs that are throughout the Pacific Ocean. As you can see here, these are several bleaching events that occurred in 2014, 2015, 2016, and there have been more recent bleaching events as well, and they've been equally severe in some cases. And you can kind of see that the pattern isn't the same. But the thing that happens with bleaching is that it takes a while for the reef to recover. So if you see what's happened over the course of just a few years in a row, right, it doesn't give the reef ecosystem enough time to recover. So this is part of our modern life. This is part of what it's bringing to bear on these wonderful natural ecosystems that were sort of living on their own before the advent of their modern industrial era. But I wanted to finish off with just a little bit of some suggestions of hope, right? Because the reality is, even though we know that there's a lot of things about the way the world is right now, particularly humans' relationships with the natural environment, there are also a lot of things that people are doing to work really hard to try and continue to maintain what we have left, right? And these are a few different newspaper articles that also speak to some of the same things that are being imagined right now in the islands, right? So you can see up there, Kauai is one of the islands in the island chain, and they have an energy cooperative that has been able at peak operating times to supply all of its subscribers with 100% renewable energy. There are a lot of different types of renewable energy projects that are underway right now in the islands. People are trying to imagine different ways to sort of live within the environment and generate all the energy they need without having to use coal or oil or natural gas, any of those things. And you can also see there are different ideas about how you can reforest areas, and there's so much we're still learning about how forests operate and what it would be like to reforest or kind of help an area recover from having had, clear cutting or having been plowed down for some sort of other modern development that becomes very exclusive. And at the same time, there have also been rebounds in different animal species, right? There's been an incredible rebound in the humpback whale population. And this one is talking about the South Atlantic humpback whale population. But just in general, we've seen there are several populations that have rebounded and really come back from extinction. And some of those are animals that live within the Pacific Ocean as well. So there are plenty of things we can do now and are doing that can make a huge difference. This slide, which is probably going to be a little bit hard to see, is what's called the Ahupua'a system. My book refers to this kind of, in the late stages of the book, this becomes something that's very important, and I don't want to give away with any spoilers or anything like that. But this represents the way that the native Hawaiian community, like all of the islands, were able to find their own ways to live a very fulfilling and vibrant life within the boundaries of the ecosystems that were prepared. And what they did was they created these stripes that kind of went from the peaks of valleys or mountains all the way down to the sea through all the different ecological zones. And they understood what different parts of those stripes were going to be valuable to the other parts, and how to trade between those different zones in terms of people that worked in the higher lands trading with people that worked in the seas and things like that, to get all the things they needed from each other, while each maintaining their section of the stripe in a way that made it work for everybody else, right? That's the Ahupua'a system. And there are even there's work that's being done today in a variety of parts of the islands to reimagine that sort of a reality, that sort of a relationship with the natural world within the context of our modern lives, right? So there are several schools that have done agricultural work to build Ahupua'a-like systems or other sustainable agricultural systems that the students then go and work in. And that same food, all those things they grow, are the same things they eat at their school, right? So they're truly experiencing the full farm to table network, that whole chain. And you really come to, I think, recognize the incredible miracle, right, of raising food and eating that food and having it nourish your body. It completely changes your idea of your relationship with the world. And so those things are happening today, and they will continue to happen in the islands, and I believe they will continue to scale out farther. And so those are some of the things I see as the future of the islands that are going to be very promising and give me a lot of hope for the future of the islands. I'll leave it there for now. You're back.
Hello. Hey, that was great.
I think everybody can see both of us. This is an incredibly disorienting platform. So, but I think it's you and me now. So
yeah. Hey, so just at the end there, so a few things popped out as you were talking about the Ahupua'a system. And also you mentioned about how in Costa Rica, I think the news was, or you're planting crops with trees is resulting in magical regeneration. And that reminded me of there's a researcher at the University of British Columbia in Canada who's been doing a lot of work with trying to understand how forest communities work, how trees are essentially helping each other out through these underground networks. And it's really interesting to see almost that same thing happening in Hawaii with that, kind of understanding the natural flow of resources and how some parts of the chain aren't getting what they need, so someone else needs to kind of chip in and supply that. So that was really interesting for me.
Yeah, no, it's It's interesting, and you can even see, there are several books that have been, there are mini books as well as papers and essays and things that have been written more recently about people starting to recognize a variety of indigenous beliefs in different ecosystems in which, a long time ago, before we had the sort of modern conveniences that gave you almost like a barrier between yourself and the realities of the natural world in terms of what it takes to survive and to actually like live within the boundaries of the land.
Yeah.
When you were living in these same spaces thousands of years ago, you had to know how to live sustainably within those spaces and how you needed to live within the boundaries of the different animal systems that were there, and like which parts of the ecosystem were valuable and which ones were more dangerous. And so there's even, there's work that's being done now in places like, whether it's California or Australia, where they're realizing that in terms of managing the forests there to protect against forest fires, there has to be some level of controlled burning and sort of a slightly different idea of how to manage the forest than in the past. It was just like, oh no, just stomp on any fire that happens, you put it out immediately. But people that had lived there a really long time ago, that wasn't the way that they dealt with that. Like there was an understanding that it needed to be some sense of like managing the understory in a way that prevented some of the forest fires. That's just one example. I know that there are also people that have done work I think in the Great Lakes region, as well as in some of the coastal regions. I'm thinking of BC. There's a First Nations tribe there that has a really good understanding of how you can replenish coastal water areas through a variety of sort of farming techniques. I can't remember the exact species. I want to say clams, but I don't think that's right. It might be oysters. But there's a set of like mussels that you can manage within sort of the coastal areas that can totally replenish an ecosystem. So there's a lot of other places where it's happening, not just in Hawaii. So.
Right. Yeah. One thing that struck me about your book that I found sad. Well, I found a fair bit sad, but one of the things that I found sad was the Malia, if I'm pronouncing that right, Malia, the mother in the family. Yeah. How she's from Hawaii, right? She's from there. She's born there, but she's also kind of not like she's not able to get what she needs out of the place because of the economic problems that you were mentioning. How she has to work as a custodian in a in an office, and so there's not that there's sort of this, she's there but she's not really there, and it made me think a little bit of the and so there's desire for more, there's desire to feel that connection, and that reminded me of the pandemic a little bit. How we're all sitting in our homes, for those of us lucky enough to have backyards, we go in our backyards, and bird watching really took off during the pandemic. So I feel like it's that same kind of thing, like that lack of connection to the place where you are, and people are just out there learning birdsong and getting these apps to figure out what a white-throated sparrow is. So that's yeah, I thought you described it.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think that is something that's you're right that the book in a lot of ways can be a little bit there. It's a rough ride there for a little bit in the middle. I think my wife I think she probably would have put the book down if she hadn't known me as a writer. She's like, man, it's a little bit rough here in the middle. They make a lot of people in the family make bad decisions, and you're kind of like, no, don't do that. And then they do it anyway. Right. But one of the things that was really, I found really interesting. One of the things I love the most about the book, if we're talking about the pandemic, is the way that I felt a complete escape when I was reading, Owls of the Eastern Ice. It was so fun to feel like I was just going on this adventure with you into like one of the last wild places in the world. And I think we had been talking briefly, when we had met previously, that, for me, I love the idea of places that are so wild that you really recognize, they make you humble as a person, and you realize how little you matter to the rest of the world. Like when you go out into these wild places, there's very little separating you from death, from really incredible risks and things like that. And it's so easy for us to hide, within a more comfortable space and not recognize, the reckoning that there is with the natural elements when you're kind of out in those spaces. I wonder for you, whether you found, what are your feelings as you spend time in places like that? When you come back from one of these trips and you're thinking about it later on, what are some of the feelings you have? I don't know if you can talk about that a little bit.
Well, going from, it's very claustrophobic coming back to the U.S. after one of these trips. I mean, I have young kids now, so I don't spend nearly as much time in one go as I used to, but I used to go over for 3 months at a time, and you really are just kind of outside the whole time. Sometimes you go into a cabin, or a truck, but mostly you're outside. And then walking into a Target in Minneapolis is one of the most disorienting things. There's all I want is a box of cereal, and there's an entire there's thousands, right? There's thousands of boxes of cereal. So that's something, and there's a big difference too, because everyone that I interact with over there is healthy, pretty much. I mean, they're all in really good shape, because you kind of have to be, because living your life makes you healthy. I remember when Felix one year we were sitting around in the truck, and he's like, I just heard about some food that has no calories in it. Like, why would you eat food on purpose that has no calories? Because it was just so far outside his realm of his reality, where like you're trying to cram as much food in your mouth as possible to get as much energy as you can to survive, because you're chopping wood, you're hauling water. So that's always just the difference of lifestyle is always jarring.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that's also interesting to me, and this could also be the case for, I had spent some time living abroad in a variety of parts of sub-Saharan Africa, whether it's West Africa and like Liberia and Ghana and Nigeria, but I also lived in southern sub-Saharan Africa in Namibia for a while. And one of the things that was always really interesting to me is living in spaces in which people are living these very, very basic lifestyles, very close to the land. I wonder what your thoughts are, what the perspectives are of some of the people that you spent time with, in terms of their thoughts about where they fit in with the natural world. Because sometimes we kind of romanticize, or we talk about different cultures that live close to the land, or that are living in an existence that requires them to live in a really close concert with the land. And it's always like people get this sense that it's like a purely positive and harmonious relationship, where that hasn't always been the experience for me. I found that in a lot of cases, people were sort of, yes, out of necessity, they live close to the land and they understand it, but there are a lot of things about it that are really awful, right? And one of the ways I'm thinking about that in terms of sub-Saharan Africa is that, there are people that live close to game reserves and things like that, and it can become a very contentious relationship where, they have artificial barriers put up in areas where they used to be able to roam freely, and all of a sudden animals are showing up and destroying their crops, or attacking their families and things, and they can't retaliate or protect themselves, because these are animals that exist in this like larger game system that they don't really have an opportunity to participate in, Yeah. And so I wonder what some of your experiences have been in that realm, with people that are living in spaces that either are things that have been set aside as preserves, or they're living in a place in which they live close to the land and might have a totally different perspective. I don't know if you could talk about that a little.
Yeah, I think there's just like anywhere, there's a spectrum, but especially the relationship with tigers, especially, is problematic. This is it's a really, really big cat. It's a giant predator that's just wandering around the forest, and so people feel threatened by that, and also because so many people are relying on the forest for meat. They view tigers as competitors. So if the tiger gets a deer, that's one less deer that I get to feed my family with. And so it's and then also a problem with reserves specifically. The Russian system is a different classifications of reserve, but the most there's one called the Zapovednik, which is a strict reserve. So the only people in there are allowed in there legally are scientists and rangers protecting it. And so if you plop one of these things down, like you were saying, like right next to a human settlement where people kind of used to be able to use these forests without being fined, that causes animosity. And so kind of a paradigm shift over the last few years in Russia anyway is really trying to mend some of those bridges and engage stakeholders. People, the people who live there have, they feel like they have just as much right to the forest and using these natural resources as the people who are protecting it, but they feel like they're being excluded. And so by having broader discussions where you bring hunters to the table and sit down and understand their motivations and try to find common ground, I think is really important. And also change, so that the Zapovednik system has changed slightly, where part of the mandate now is education, public education. So parts of it are opened up so that people who live nearby can come in and swim on the beach that they used to swim on, for example. So I think that's what's most important is engaging the people who rely on that space, and excluding them I feel it's always a bad idea. That's never going to end well. we're all in this together. We need to work on it together, not break into different camps.
Yeah. What do you think are some of the things that you found most valuable in engaging, I don't even want to say across the aisle, because that suggests there's some sort of like partisanship in the middle, but just, when you're engaging with groups that are in this sort of contentious relationship and trying to sort out how everybody can kind of come to a place of some form of agreement. What are some of the things that you found most useful? I know, obviously, just from reading the book, I loved seeing sections where you're out there having these great discussions with people. And I was like, wow, if that was me, it would be completely impossible without an interpreter. And so obviously just being able to speak fluent Russian is wonderful. And that's like a great asset. But, in addition to having some sense of the language, I don't know, are there certain touchstones for ways that you found experiences that were, common experiences you were able to have with people from different cultures that helped foster the sort of relationships you're talking about, where getting everybody to the table becomes much easier?
Yeah, so most of my interactions with industry, I guess, is with loggers. And I do think that the successes that I've had that are described in the book, I think are they're relatively unique. And a lot of it has to do with my long-term relationship in Russia, and in specifically this one town, this one county in a rural area. By being able to understand the cultural context of where people are coming from, being able to the guy who runs one of the logging companies was born in this village of 800 people. Now runs this company. He knows the rivers well, he knows the forests well, he hunts there, he fishes there. And being able to have a conversation with this guy and use the old names for the rivers, so the pre-1972, whatever, the old Chinese names before the Soviet Union changed all the names to Russian names.
Wow,
that tells him right there, it's like, oh, wait a minute, okay, this guy, he understands this place. He knows what this place means. Like the old names had meanings. One was like the valley where cows get stuck in the mud. Another is the mountain where you can get firewood, and now it's like Tiger 1, Tiger 2, Tiger 3. It's they're now meaningless. And so, kind of coming at that in this very personal, very local way, that very much helps get people to, because they understand that you have some of the same passions. Like, yes, my job might be cutting down trees, and yes, your job might be trying to not have people cut down trees, but we at least love the same place and can find common ground as a result.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a sense of humility is important. I'm thinking about this in the same, from my perspective, because sometimes people have read my book and afterwards I can tell there's this sense of guilt or discomfort. They're like, well, does that mean I shouldn't, should I stay away from the islands? And I certainly don't want to project that, right, when I'm talking about Hawaii or what this book shows, because I think in a lot of ways it has you can see that there's a lot of anger and resentment and friction between the way things were and the native population and the way things are now and everything that happened in between, which I talked about earlier in those slides. And everybody's going to have their own answer. And I'm sure there's some people in the islands that are like, we don't want anybody to come. But I think there's a lot of other people that would be very happy and are actually happy to have lots of visitors when there's a cultural exchange that happens on a level playing field. Yeah, and there's an equal valuation of both places. And that requires a lot of humility. Yeah. So one of the things I talk about a lot when people are asking me like, well, I'm going to go to the islands, like, how should I behave? And I'm like, the first thing you need to do is you just need to be very humble, and you need to be open to everything not being defined in the terms that you want, right? Not to go to a place and be like, I want the islands to be this way, and I'm going to do what I need to do to make them be what I want them to be. But rather to go with an open mind and to think a lot about like, maybe some of the places you want to visit aren't the kind of places you should be visiting, right? Like if you see a path that leads to some remote area, maybe don't think you can just go walking on that path that might go through people's backyards or go to places that are considered sacred or things like that. And just because you see it there, you're like, well, I'm just going to go walk there because I'm here on vacation and I can do what I want. Those sorts of things, like just taking a moment to slow down and think for a minute about whether or not everything that you're doing is something that is coming from a position of assuming you get to do whatever you want in the islands versus trying to live within, the context of the place as it is, especially when you're familiar with the history of the islands. You understand the history, thinking back to that and knowing, okay, so some of the way things are now is not the way they should be. And so just because everything is the way it is, and some people are saying, yeah, you can come here and do this thing or that thing, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you should reconsider some of the things you're doing and think about the way those impact the local land and the local economy and the people that live there every day, right? And try to live in the place, like, imagine it's your own backyard, sort of, right? Like, what would you be doing if this was, would you be doing this in your backyard, or, you know, things like that. So I think we have some comments we want to open up, or questions. We've got about 10 minutes left. So I don't know where Annie is. I think she's going to help facilitate that.
Great.
Oh, there she comes. It's like magic.
Yeah, I'm like the Wizard of Oz back here. Yeah, so we have some great comments so far. I don't see any questions yet, so ask your questions now so we can make sure we get to them. But I do want to give a shout out to everyone who's like given a comment so far, because we've got people watching from St. Paul and from California and from New Zealand and from the Bronx. So that's awesome. Thanks everyone
That's great.
for being here. Yeah, so I don't know. If you don't have a question, if you haven't written your question yet, do it now so that we can see it. And I don't know, I'll let you guys just kind of.
I can talk about another. I do want to talk about success stories, given that it's Earth Day, right?
Yeah.
I feel like we need to have positive stories. So there's been, there's a the Amur leopard. I showed a picture of that thing in my presentation. I mean, this was, everyone was sure that this cat was on its way toward extinction. There were like 40 of these things left in the wild. They only live in this sliver of Russia, right on the China border, right by North Korea. And about 20 years ago, people started to take this more seriously, and we had government sign. A nature reserve was created by the federal Russian government. The Russian government got serious about it and put funding into the management of this place. People started improving the anti-poaching measures, and it's essentially that's allowed just by having people care and start showing that, okay, we're now going to protect these resources. There are legal places you can do things. You can't be in here poaching deer. Poaching numbers have decreased in this place. Deer numbers have gone up. Leopard numbers have gone up by something like 50% in just a 20-year period. And so that's I think that's a great there's there's what, there's like 80 of these things now. It's not that many, but the point is, and they're also expanding across into China now, because there's enough space for them in Russia anymore, and the Chinese government created a protected area over on that side. So it's this like international effort with NGOs, with governments, to take this seriously and give these cats a chance. And I just think that's a great example of, if people want to do it, maybe we can.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah, we got a question from Kimberly. You both traveled and worked in such different places. How'd you meet?
Like a week ago or something? No, so really what happened is we were trying to think of something to do for Earth Day, some sort of event to have for Earth Day, and I had known about Jonathan's book and had known about, how the critical acclaim it was receiving, and had an understanding of kind of the overview of it. And, when people were sort of asking me to do events and this one ended up happening on Earth Day, I was like, well, it'd be cool to do something not only that has, some level of, can speak to the themes of Earth Day, but also that it has authors from Minnesota, and so I was like, who's another author from Minnesota that has a book that came out this year that has some elements of conservation? And, Jonathan's name was one of the first ones that popped in my head. And I think it was also probably late and I was desperate and people were asking who was going to be on the panel. I was just like, I don't know. So yeah, so then that was it. I think we've started to meet each other through each other's work, really, through each other's books. So
yeah, and I don't know where Kimberly is based, but yeah, here in the Twin Cities, it's like there's so many writers and authors and people in this industry, and so it's like they don't all know each other yet, but it's pretty easy to find a writer who like kind of is a good match. Yeah, so thanks. And we have someone watching from Georgia.
Yeah, that's my mom.
Yeah, I was gonna say. My mom's on here too somewhere. Yeah, so I don't know. What are you both working on now? Got any?
Yeah,
Snippets you want
that's a
to
really great question. What do you got going on, Jonathan? What's coming up next?
I don't have anything going on right now. I've had my my Johnson & Johnson shot, so I'm getting ready to get back out there, and I can't. I get my inspiration by being in interesting places and interacting with interesting people and seeing interesting wildlife. And so I'm in my wife's former walk-in closet, and I've been here since last March, and there's no windows. It's not that inspiring, I'll be honest with you. So I have a trip planned to Alaska where I do some work in August, and so that will be utterly fantastic. And I think that'll get the creative juices flowing again.
That's fantastic. Alaska is such an incredible natural environment. It's like just awe-inspiring natural beauty. I had the fortune to visit once very briefly, and it was I want to go back so bad. It's such an incredible space. For me, I'm working on another novel. It's been a little bit slower going than I would have liked. The first, I guess, probably the almost half to 3/4 of last year just felt like it was obliterated in terms of trying to get writing done. Me and my wife were at home with both of our children trying to work full time and do our children's like remote school. I mean, we were teachers and parents and employees all at the same time. And so that writing just was gone. Writing was not something that was happening for a lot of that time. And so towards the tail end of the year, I started writing again, but it's kind of come and gone some. But yeah, I'm working on another novel. It spans like about 200 years. There are these elements of sort of ancient, like feudal warfare. It's like I have like a fictional Pacific island that it's set in, twinned Pacific islands in the past, and then there's a part of it that's set in like the distant future and a kind of climate change future. It's optimistic though, so I've been working on that part of it as well. So there's some like Game of Thrones stuff in there, and then there's some like really cool futuristic, optimistic stuff in it, and it's fun. I don't know. I like it a lot, but I've had to spend a lot of time doing a lot of research. There's a lot of research it took to get. I've just started writing it probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago, actually writing the text itself. So.
Cool. Well, that sounds awesome. Let's see if did I miss any locations? Oh yeah, just some nice comments here. I always like to hear about the owls, but I also loved Kawai's presentation too. Can't wait to read his book. Thanks, Kimberly. Here we go. From Christopher, for both of you, can you name some writers who inspired you to write these books in particular, and how so?
Kawai, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's I don't know if this particular book was inspired by a writer, but just writers off the top of my head that I can think of that I've named a few of them before, and they're in the thank you section of the book or in the acknowledgments. But writers from the islands, a few of the ones that I encountered just as a young adult, or when I first started sort of getting into literature and books beyond kind of standard genre stuff, were Kiana Davenport, who's written several books. One of them is Shark Dialogues, right? And so it has some of the same things that are in my book are very similar to things that were in her book. And she has several other books. That's not the only book that she's written. There's another author named Kiana Davenport who came out with a short story collection. At this point, I want to say it was like 5 years ago, called This Is Paradise. And she kind of has a more modern look at the islands. And it's a set of short stories that rotate through different people's lives. Those are a few authors from the islands that I can think of off the top of my head. And, then there are writers like Barbara Kingsolver and the Poisonwood Bible. I think most people who are familiar with that book and see this one, they'll kind of see fingerprints all over it. I could keep going, but we don't have a ton of time, so I'll give Jonathan some space. Yeah,
so the first one that came to my mind is obscure. I mean, it's Vladimir Arseniev. It's this guy that wrote this book that I translated a few years ago. But he was he was in the Russian military at the turn of last century, and he was charged with, or tasked, I should say, charged. He was tasked with kind of exploring Primoria, and so it's the same places that I work in now that he was walking through 100 years ago, interacting with Chinese hunters, Korean farmers, the Udege, the Nanai. And what I liked most about his work was that I think a lot of people writing exploration books and hunting books in his day were beating their chests about how amazing they were and how heroic they were, and he'd have a chapter be like, oh, I went to the woods to hunt, I got excited following this boar, and totally got lost. I was in the rain for 3 days. I was terrified. Luckily, these dudes found me, otherwise I'd be dead. And so I found that really refreshing that he was so honest, that he was alone. He could have said whatever he wanted. And so I always had that in the back of my mind as I was writing this book too, where, I don't need to gloss over my failures. You just tell it like it is. It comes across as a better story. So that was mine.
Nice. Here's one from Charlie. Have either of you had a cultural experience in Minnesota that would rival a cultural experience from a unique place you've lived or worked globally?
So I haven't been here very long, and the pandemic has been in effect I've been here longer under a pandemic than I have not a pandemic at this point. So I haven't gotten to spend as much time sort of out and about. There's so many parts of this state that I haven't even seen yet, right? I haven't really been to the farther northern parts of Minnesota, whether we're talking about the Iron Range or over by we call it the North Shore, which I have problems with because there's only one North Shore, and it's where Waimea Bay and Bonsai Pipeline are. So when we talk about the North Shore here, it's okay if you want to use that for a little while, but soon, like Hawaii wants that back soon. So you only got like 5 more years to use the North Shore, then you need to find another term. Anyway, I haven't been up there yet, so I'd like to be there. I'd like to spend some time. I have fantasies of like taking getting like a folding kayak and going up into the Boundary Waters and just spending like multiple days, portaging and being out there on my own. But we'll see if that ever happens or not. But no, there's a lot of the state that I have yet to see, and it's got a very rich cultural heritage. I'm excited about the opportunity to do that as we kind of get through the pandemic.
And no, Charlie, I haven't. I mean, I've had some pretty gnarly cultural experiences in other places that Minnesota can't quite yet match.
Kawai, I had no idea how recently you had moved here when you did your event for the launch of this book last year. Didn't know that.
Yeah, we've been here less than a year. I came a bunch with my wife. My wife's from here, and her family.
Okay.
So that's why we moved here. But I'd been here several times during the winter. Lots of winter vacations. We would come here. So I've been here in the winter, but not for a significant period of time.
Yeah.
Just a couple of weeks at a time.
Okay, so let's do one last question from Charles. So this is for Jonathan. Is the Russian government seriously committed to preserving wilderness character of Primorye, or is it under unrelenting pressure to develop, industry-wise?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. There are, tigers are a cultural symbol of Russia. Like it's part of their national pride. And so tiger conservation and leopard conservation are taken extremely seriously. So yes, like as far as that's concerned, it's very serious. The flip side of that is there are also colonization, the settlement incentives. So people from other parts of Russia are able to get parcels of land for free in Primorye if they come and they just like the standard settlement package, right? You go, you get reduced taxes, you get whatever, and so that's really I find that really unfortunate. I think it's great that the human population of Primorye is declining because that's better for the wildlife. So there is strong protection in protected areas, but I feel like there's also this weird draw to kind of bring people out there to bolster the human populations, which isn't as positive from my perspective.
Got it. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. They were great, and for your comments and for saying hello. Thank you, Jonathan and Kawai, for your presentations and your reading and your conversation. It was a very fun way to spend Earth Day with the two of you. So yeah, don't be a stranger. For those of you who are watching, if there anyone who is in the Twin Cities area, we didn't get any shout outs. Oh, we got a St. Paul person. If you want to pick up their books in person, Majors and Quinn is open to browsing, limited capacity browsing, mask required, of course. We're open 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. daily. So if you do want to stop by and say hello, the booksellers would love to see you. Oh, and look at this. What is this that Kawai has in his hand?
Yeah, this is the week to be doing this, right? So we're an independent bookstore day is coming up on Saturday.
Yes.
But this year, Rain Taxi has, every year there's kind of like this, you kind of get this passport to hit all the independent bookstores in the Twin Cities. And normally it's just like this one day bonanza where you have to try and get to as many bookstores as you can in a single day. And you get these great little illustrations of each bookstore, and then you get a stamp. I think I've got it up into Majors and Twin. No, it's in here somewhere. Where's Majors and Twin? Yeah.
There we are.
Majors and Quinn, and it's got the stamp in there. So you stop by, you can get one of these passports, get stamps, and if you get 10 stamps, then it unlocks the coupons that are available at these different stores.
Yeah.
And then if you get all of the stamps, there's some kind of, I don't know. I think you get to own Minnesota for a day or something.
Yes,
I'm not quite sure what the terms are.
Rain taxi is very powerful, and
something happens. You get to write your own law or something.
Yeah,
I don't know what happens if you get all 22.
I think you get a book deal.
Okay, well, that's kind of cool. I'd rather have my own mom. Anyway, it's really fun.
But you can enter to win fabulous prizes the more bookstores you visit, and then for every bookstore you do visit and get a stamp, you unlock that coupon. Normally it's just one day, like I was saying, but of course this year every bookstore is open in a different way. Some are not yet open to the public. Some are only doing curbside pickup. We're doing a combination of all those things. So you had a week to go and get these stamps. But today, tomorrow, and Saturday.
Yep, Saturday is the big day. Yeah, there are all sorts of, all these bookstores have all these really cool things going on Saturday. There's like exclusive books. I know there's a version of Sharks that's got like a purple, like it's gorgeous cover. I had to sign a bunch of them, so I know what it looks like, but I didn't get one. So I'm going to try and see if I can get one. They didn't send me. I don't have one. It's super cool. But yeah, there's all these like special limited edition books from all these different bookstores, and there's lots of great stuff going on. There'll be some places I think that are doing like outdoor kind of pop-up shop things. So.
Just head to the Rain Taxi website, raintaxi.com. They have a lot of Indie Bookstore Day info for you. And thanks for supporting independent bookstores by tuning into this, by shopping, and hope to see you again.
Yeah.